Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Fashion Policy in Action program, where we're going to explore how fashion and policy intersect and how we can become a part of shaping this more sustainable future for fashion. I'm Holly. I'm Remix Community Manager. It's really great to see you guys here. Some new faces too. I love to see new faces join us on our monthly programs. Before I dive in, just letting you know again that this call is being recorded and we're going to share a recap after, and the recording will go to Remake's YouTube channel. As folks are coming in, feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, maybe share one word that describes how you're feeling about fashion and policy right now, something that you're looking to learn today. I'd love to see in the chat where you're coming from joining us today and kind of where your head is at. For anyone that is new to Remake, we're a global advocacy organization advocating for fair pay, climate justice, and human rights in the clothing industry. Our community includes students, professionals, activists, and everyday consumers pushing for accountability across supply chains in fashion. I'm really thrilled to introduce today's guest. We have Hilary Jochmans with us, founder of Jochmans Consulting, LLC, and Politically in Fashion, which we're going to hear a lot more about on this call. Some initiatives from Politically in Fashion include spearheading advocacy with brands and thought leaders for the creation of a fashion czar in the US, and calls to action for the Federal Trade Commission to update the green guides and include textiles in the recycling conversation, which is huge. The Politically in Fashion Council is the membership, advocacy, and educational arm of Politically in Fashion and includes members from fashion design, from manufacturing, from recycling and reuse communities. Hilary is also a policy expert and advocate who has spent many years on Capitol Hill, bridging the worlds of fashion and legislation. She is here today to help us understand what's happening at the policy level in fashion and how we can take action where we are in our own communities. Thank you for dropping in the chat some feelings. I see you guys are feeling lukewarm about fashion, feeling hopeful about fashion legislation, optimistic. That's great to feel too. I'm definitely feeling hopeful. And I think after today's call, we'll have a lot more insight on what we can do to address those lukewarm feelings and have more of a idea of what we can do to make a difference. So Hilary, thank you so much. We're so excited to have you here. I will give you the floor to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. Okay, I will try to be hopeful. That will help me sort of set the tone for our conversation today. Um, it's hard for me to monitor the chat while I'm talking here. So, Holly, just pipe up if you see anybody has any questions that we're definitely going to have plenty of time for questions at the end, but I'm happy to answer questions as we go along too. But just pipe up and let me know if there is a question. I'm curious to know, maybe you can put it in the chat for folks. Is anybody currently working in the fashion industry, either on the brand side or design, manufacturing, or if you have any experience in policy development, if you've interned someplace or things like that, I'd love to see where folks are at. So I'm going to use some slides today to sort of guide our conversation a little bit, and we will take it from there. So if we could go next slide. So one of the things I want to talk about today is having a seat at the table, right? And why that's so important and why fashion needs to have a seat at the table. How we do this, why we should do it, some examples of fashion and advocacy that we've seen over the past couple of years here in the United States, and then some takeaways for you as a business leader or personally in your advocacy journey, and things that I think will be universally helpful as you go along. So next slide. Okay, so why is it that we're allowed a seat at the table? Why do we even get to participate in this in democracy? Well, over 230 years ago in the Constitution, there is the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to advocate. Lobbying actually is guaranteed in the Constitution. It is through the phrase to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It's a fancy way of saying sharing your views, letting people know what matters to you. But unfortunately, too often people feel intimidated by the process, or they're just not sure how to begin, or just don't have the bandwidth or the time to really engage. So that's what we're trying to do to break down those barriers and make sure people feel educated about policy, that they then feel empowered with this knowledge to then go engage with their elected representatives. That is the mission of Politically in Fashion. So next slide, please. All right, just a little vocabulary here. So advocacy versus lobbying. I know myself, I use the terms kind of interchangeably a lot of times, but there is a difference. So advocacy, think of as your personal values that you are wanting to advance versus lobbying, which is the professionalized version of it. So personally, you might be very active on promoting women's rights, trans rights, environmental issues, the budget for your local school board, any of those things that impact you sort of personally. But professionally, it's when it impacts your business. And there are laws and rules around lobbying. So as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., I am registered and I have to disclose who my clients are and what they pay me. Your advocacy really, to be successful, needs to be authentic. It needs to be baked into your business's ethos. You know, people can see through if it's just something you're kind of trying on because it looks like the cool thing to do. It should really be a core to your business to be successful. And you have opportunities to engage in public policy at every step of development. And we're going to talk a little bit about that going forward. So next slide, please. I know this probably seems very basic to everyone, but I'd like to just sort of set the table with think about the structure of the federal government. I'm going to focus most of my comments today on federal because that's what I primarily do. But of course, there are opportunities for advocacy in all the state governments and your local governments too. So on the federal government, you've got the Constitution. We have our three branches of government: Congress, executive, and federal courts. They're supposed to all serve as check and balance on each other. I think recently we've seen that come under fire with a lot of the policies that are happening in Washington, but that won't be the focus for today's talk. Next slide, please. So let's talk about really kind of how a bill becomes a law. And in each of these stages, there's an opportunity for you to share your views and to influence the process. I'm going to go through this really quickly. I'm happy to talk about it more later, but just a quick overview. So, where does the idea come from for a bill? It could come from the congressional person, him or herself, or it could come from an individual, from their constituent, and you bring it to your member and say, hey, there's a problem. This needs to be solved. This idea is then translated into legislation, into a bill form. There are lawyers that work on drafting this. The bill is introduced. A member will get support, and they call it co-sponsors from other members of Congress who want to be associated with this bill, even though they didn't come up with the idea. They want to lend their support. The bill should then go through the relevant committee. So, a bill about financial services is going to go through the Financial Services Committee. A bill about healthcare is going to go through the Ways and Means Committee, things like that. You have hearings where you have experts come in and give their views on the issue or the bill. Ideally, then there'll also be a markup, which is an opportunity to add amendments and make changes to the text of the legislation before it then goes to the floor where the whole House would vote on this measure. And then don't forget, this all has to happen on the other body too. So the Senate would have to also have a comparable bill. And then both houses have to pass identical language. And then it goes to the president for signature or veto. So, this is the way ideally it happens. Sometimes this can move really quickly, in a matter of weeks. When maybe there's a national emergency, things are going to go really quickly. And sometimes these things take years. And I think that can be really distressing for folks. They feel like this is a problem now. Why aren't we doing something on it now? And bringing it back to what you mentioned before about the idea of hope. I don't want people to lose hope because you're not seeing progress right now. There are any number of reasons that can be. It can be the political environment. It can just be the time it takes. It can be just getting the attention for the issue because there are so many issues going on here in Washington right now, and it's just hard to get attention. So don't lose hope because it's taking a while. That's sometimes just the way things go. Next slide, please. Um, this is kind of an odd place for the slide, but I talked about sort of how a bill becomes a law, and I talked about committee development, things like that. There's another function here called caucuses. So they're not committees. So it's not like the Financial Services Committee or the Ways and Means Committee. These are caucuses. These are groups of representatives who come together because they have a common goal or shared interest. They don't have legislative authority, so you're not going to have any hearings or markups. They're not going to move a bill, but it is an excellent opportunity to highlight an issue, to get attention. Because like I said before, there are so many things happening in Washington right now, and you need to get that focus on your issue. So just in the last couple of years, these caucuses have come out. There are hundreds of caucuses, but these ones that I think are particularly interesting to this group. There's the Slow Fashion Caucus, the Textile Caucus, a Recycling Caucus, Manufacturing Caucus, thinking about how important, we want to build up our domestic manufacturing capabilities here in the US. The Climate Solutions Caucus, which is actually a bipartisan, so members of the House who are both Republicans and Democrats coming together on climate issues. And the most recent one is the Recommerce Caucus, or the Secondhand Caucus, which is really fascinating to see. And we're hoping to see some good events coming out with them next year.
I want to
Next,
jump in on
sure.
that page because I'm from your first question that you asked to the group, a few folks responded. We have Sarah here. She works at the Real on the sales side, also has some involvement in their sustainability division.
Right.
We have Gabriella with us today. She has experience in merchandising, working at Newly for women's bottoms. And then we have Leah, founder of a designer brand, Impact Luxury. For these caucuses, is there an opportunity for these folks to join or bring back to their offices and talk about this if they're not a part of them? Or maybe you know that they are the Real and Newly.
So the caucus, the membership is just members of Congress. So you
Got
wouldn't
it.
have
Okay.
private sector folks in that. But one of the things we're doing at Politically in Fashion is to bridge the gap there. So to make sure that businesses are connecting with these caucuses to have the dialogue and share the information. But the caucuses are just informal associations of the members of Congress. Next slide, please. Um, Rules are also really important here too. I won't go through the whole list right now, but rules that you see, that we have one pending right now on labeling for clothes. The green guides are rules. There's a process for this, the same that there is for legislation, and there are ways to impact the discussion here as well. Because in fact, the rules process mandates a public comment period. So again, one of the things we do at Politically in Fashion is to be monitoring these rules that are out there to make sure that we are making comments and letting folks know what is important to our members and broader in the industry. I'm going to talk more about the green guides in a little bit, but that was an example of an opportunity for public comment. In 2012, when they updated the green guides the last time, they had several hundred comments, but only 2 were from the fashion industry. This time, when they went to update them, although they have not been published yet, in 2024, we had hundreds of comments from the fashion industry. So we'd love to see greater engagement here because this is something that really impacts this industry. Next slide. Okay. We're gonna do a quick case study here on fashion, talk a little bit about why fashion is a business. And I know a lot of folks on this call know that and appreciate that, but you'd be surprised how many people do not. They think of fashion still as something that's flirty and fun and the bright, shiny object, and not realizing that it is an industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about some bills and rules that are pending right now that I think would be of interest, and then a few examples of some advocacy that we've done in this space. So next slide, please. A few stats on the fashion industry. You can read them here, but remember, this is a estimated $2 trillion industry. This is not a hobby, folks. This is an industry, and we want folks to behave like an industry and to be treated like the industry and the economic driver that they are. And that was something I saw firsthand. I used to run the New York governor's office here in Washington. And, during the financial crisis, and you saw what was happening to the financial industry in New York. Okay, well, what's the second biggest industry in New York City? What's going to keep the economy going here? And it was the fashion industry. And people should realize that and understand that laws and regulations that are out there really impact this industry, and it has big economic effect. And so we try to highlight that as much as we can in our work. Next slide, please. There are some laws and regulations or potential ones that are out there right now that are very impactful to the industry. I'll go through these just quickly. I'm sure folks are familiar with a lot of them. Closing the de minimis loophole. I know that's something Remake was very engaged in. Tariffs, the Fabric Act, also another Remake priority. Green guides, labeling, and domestic manufacturing. Next slide. So I'm sure folks heard a lot about in the last year about closing the de minimis loophole. This was an exception in US trade law where items that were of a low dollar value could bypass certain duties and inspections. And the idea was these low dollar ones shouldn't be such a big problem. We had to free up the resources of the Custom and Border Patrol, CBP, so they could focus their attention on the bigger imports that were coming in. But there were some nefarious players that exploited this exception. And we're looking at Shein and Temu in this particular conversation. And so there was a lot of uproar about this. And it was very interesting to see that, while there was a segment of the conversation about drugs that were coming in through this loophole, but there was a big part of the conversation was about the fashion pieces that were coming in, again, through Shein and Temu. And this got a lot of bipartisan support. It was very rare in Washington to close this loophole. Of course, the devil was in the details, and it took a while to figure out how they were actually going to do this, but it was closed this summer. So now that exemption no longer applies. And everyone was really excited about this. But you always have to be watching for the unintended consequences. There were legitimate actors who were using this loophole. Makes it sound like it's a shady operation. I mean, it was a provision in the law. If you were under $800, you did not have to go through these certain inspections and duties. So what about the smaller designers that are bringing things in? What about folks in the sort of Etsy community? How is this going to impact them? It's really impacting their pricing and their ability to bring things in. Now, not to say we shouldn't have closed the loophole, but it's just a reminder that everyone needs to be part of this conversation, and there's not, a magic bullet that's going to fix all the problems. Everything has sort of trade-offs and pluses and minuses. Next slide, please. Tariffs has really been top of mind for folks in the industry here in Washington. Last week, the Supreme Court heard a case on the president's authority to issue these tariffs. And people were very surprised to see that not only the liberal justices, but the conservative justices were very skeptical of the president's power to levy these tariffs. So basically, there are three possible outcomes from the Supreme Court case. You're either going to keep the tariffs, you're going to limit the tariffs, or you're going to ban them altogether. And the timing for the ruling could be sometime, probably not by the end of the year, but probably in the first quarter of next year, which is unusual for Supreme Court cases. Usually they don't issue their rulings until sometime maybe late May or in June. Now, if these tariffs, these particular tariffs are ruled not allowed, what does that mean? Are businesses going to get a refund from the tariffs that were already collected? Remember, over $130 billion has already been collected in these tariffs just since the start of this year, and really, quote, Liberation Day on April 4th. If these particular tariffs are struck down, there are two other trade laws the president might use. They do give more power to Congress, which he probably won't like as much, but the tariffs may very well still continue. So the uncertainty for industry is going to continue. And I know that's very challenging for folks because you think you've just figured out what your pricing is going to be, and the tariffs keep changing, either the actual dollar amounts or the countries where the tariffs are being levied. And this uncertainty has been very problematic and challenging for the fashion industry. But perhaps all this discussion of tariffs will lead us to a broader discussion about the tariff structure in general, and maybe that should be re-examined. Next slide, please. And one of those tariff issues you might want to re-examine is what's called the pink tariffs. I think folks have heard of the idea of the pink tax, the way women's products are taxed at a higher rate than for men. Well, the same is true in some of the tariffs. There is a gender bias in tariffs. And many companies have sued to try to get rid of these tariffs for violation of the Equal Protection Clause, but all these claims have been dismissed. So there is legislation right now from two members of Congress that would direct the U.S. Treasury to study and report to Congress on the discrimination that is inherent in the tariff structure. So perhaps this will lead to a broader discussion because, right now, certain items are taxed at a higher rate, and we're not really sure why. Maybe it made sense 80 years ago when it was put into place, but not today, and really to have a wholesale examination of the tariffs. Next slide, please. One more tariff one, forever chemicals. I think that's one folks on this call really care about, trying to get those out of our products. Right now, some of the products, if you use a particular system that uses PFAS for the water resistance test, it's taxed at a lower rate. A tariff is a lower rate than if you use a more sustainable option. So this legislation would remove that requirement and allow companies to have more innovative ways to provide the water resistance without using the PFAS. But interesting way of getting at it is through the tariff system. Next slide. Fabric Act. I think a lot of folks have heard about this bill. This is built on the California Garment Worker Protection Act. It prohibits the piece rate compensation schemes, which were used to exploit a lot of workers by undermining the minimum wage standard. There is joint and several liability throughout the supply chain, which was a very new concept, and really I think got a lot of attention. And interestingly, there's money in there for technical assistance for facilities and equipment to try to build up our own domestic manufacturing here in the United States. Unfortunately, this bill has been caught up in the political environment here in Washington. Senator Gillibrand from New York, who introduced the bill, has not introduced it this year. There was a House co-sponsor, Congressman Nadler from New York. He also has not introduced it this year. And he is retiring at the end of this year too. So if it's going to continue, they'll need a new sponsor in the House side. The bill never did get any Republican sponsors, which is in this environment just a non-starter. You have to have bipartisan support if you really want to move a bill. And I'm surprised that this did not get some bipartisan support because of the money in there to support domestic manufacturing and perhaps sort of, vis-a-vis the positioning with China. I thought that we could have gotten more Republicans or any Republicans to support, but unfortunately it did not.
Do you have an idea of why that was? Like, do you think was there, I don't know, I guess my question then that I'm now thinking about is from your experience, like what's been the most effective in getting policymakers to pay attention to fashion's labor and environmental issues? Is it data, storytelling, coalition
I,
building, or something else?
I think there are a couple of questions in there. I think
Yeah.
data is huge. I think the industry, we don't provide enough, and that really helps to move the needle on legislation that you can really point to some hard and fast numbers about, who's employed, what the experiences are, what the wages are. In terms of the political environment, I think, labor issues and environmental issues do not enjoy bipartisan support in this environment. So if you have a bill that is primarily known as a labor and environmental bill,
Mm-hmm.
it might not get a lot of across the aisle support right now.
Thank you. We have one other question in the chat. What does joint and several liability mean? Also,
It,
does partisan support mean support from sponsors?
Sure. Joint and several liability is a legal term. It's a matter of who's responsible. So in the supply chain context, the brand, you could be responsible for everything going down the supply chain. So anyone who is from the factories to the farms, everything sort of up and down in that vertical. I'm sorry, what was the last question about partisan support?
Does partisan support mean support from sponsors?
So partisan support meaning if it's as opposed to being bipartisan, right? So partisan means it's just Republicans or it's just Democrats. Yes, from the bill sponsors in the House or in the Senate. You could definitely use it in a broader sense too, or if you have groups that are aligned with a political party, you could still say that it's partisan. Basically, you're usually talking about the elected officials in that context.
Thank you. One follow-up question from
Yeah,
in the chat. Those are great questions, guys. Feel free to keep dropping them in
yeah,
there. Or
please.
if you can come off mute, raise your hand and then I'll call you. But another question we have in the chat, do you think because the industry is so veiled and unregulated that the lack of data would be for that reason?
Quite possibly. Yeah. I mean, this is an industry that has not been particularly regulated. And I think it's a surprise now that legislation and bills are coming out that will be directly on point for the industry. But, a lot of fashion also is big publicly traded or at least big companies that have been compiling data on their business, just like any other business does. It's not just, super small one, two-person teams that might not be doing that. So there is data out there. I think it's a matter of collecting it in a responsible way, and sharing it in a way that's meaningful to the representatives that they can actually use this representative, and words matter in this context too. I mean, sometimes, if you're going to say global warming, there's going to be a segment of the population that's going to stop breathing right there.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's important to be truthful with the data, but put it out there in as neutral way that folks will understand it.
Mm. Thank you. Abby, I see your hand raised. Feel free to.
Yeah, thank you. Um, this is kind of an open-ended question, but about the Fabric Act, when I hear like garment worker protection in California right now, I'm thinking about what's happening with the garment workers and the, immigration policies and everything going on with ICE. And so I'm just wondering, like, if and how those things are connected. I know you kind of mentioned that it doesn't sound like the Fabric Act was as discussed this year as maybe it was last year. Um, so I'm just curious what you think about any connections there.
Sure, I think that's a great question, and I think you probably can't draw a direct line between the two, but you can draw a dotted line. um, yeah, all things like that contribute to the political environment and the discussion, and the context in which people look at these issues. Um, yeah,
Thank you.
no problem. Let's jump ahead and we get through a couple more slides here, and then we'll go back to some more questions. So that's okay. I'm going to go through some of these very quickly, but there's just ones I want folks to be paying attention to. There's legislation about labeling, right? So those labels that are on our clothes, what's on them and what format do they have to be, basically. So there's one bill that the idea is to be able to put EPA verified, Environmental Protection Agency verified information about the carbon footprint of the product. So in terms of its production, usage, end of life, things like that. So this is an example of data, right? So people could see what went into making their garment. But the idea of having the EPA verify it should provide sort of a comfort level of neutrality about it, that you can count on these statistics. They can't be sort of greenwashed when they're putting them out there. And then also about the labeling themselves, there's a petition out there to be able to get rid of the big itchy tags that we all have on our clothes, and being able to use sort of a QR code to share this information, which has a lot of benefits. You can put a lot more information on there than you can fit on the little tag. Um, we all probably rip those tags out as soon as we get them. And so I may know what was in there in terms of how to wash it, how it was made, things like that. But when I go to hopefully resell it, or donate it, that information will pass along with the garment. Otherwise, the next person who buys it doesn't know what's in there. Or if it is going to be recycled, they don't know what's in that garment if you don't have the breakdown, if it's 72% this and 6% that. So there's a lot of positives to that, but I think we're a long way off from actually seeing that come to fruition here in the States. Green Guides, it's a personal passion and project of mine. The Green Guides are put out by the Federal Trade Commission, and it has to do with marketing your products. Basically, state of play in the United States is you don't have to make anything environmentally friendly. You can make stuff full of all kinds of chemicals, and just put it out there. But unlike Europe, but if you are going to say that your product is environmentally friendly or recyclable or free of, you have to meet certain standards. And these guides were put out there to assist businesses in making these statements and to assist the public in understanding what they are. So they can't be, overly complicated. It can't be deceptive in terms of, for example, recycling. You can't say something's recyclable if really there's only one place in Montana you could actually recycle this. It has to be accessible to everybody. You can't say something is free of if it was never going to have it anyway. So these guides were last updated in 2012. So a lot's happened, both in terms of technology and consumer interest in these issues. And so Politically in Fashion had worked with a coalition of brands and thought leaders to really urge the FTC to update these guides and then to also include textiles in the recycling component of the conversation, to look at the term sustainable, which is not in the green guides, to look at what greenwashing really means. At this point, the guides have not, they started the review process. The guides, to our understanding, have not been finalized. And there is really sort of a halt on new rules or guidance coming out in the administration right now. So I'm not sure we'll see anything for a while. So, but the old guides are still in effect. And finally, domestic manufacturing. I think this is a huge issue that I would love to see get more attention in the United States. If you're looking at public policy sort of as a coin, if you've got tariffs on one side, the flip side of that coin should be domestic manufacturing. If you're going to charge more for stuff to come in, we ought to be investing in being able to make things here. You can't flip a switch and do it. And we shouldn't do it for everything. For a lot of folks, they have a great setup overseas for their production. And that's fine if it's meeting certain standards. But there is a good segment of the fashion population that would love to be able to produce here. There's a good segment of consumers who would love to purchase things that have been made here. So how do we make that work? Possibly funding or tax credits for factory modernization and worker training, institutionalizing more apprenticeship programs. And this is a little more controversial, but looking at the visas, immigration policies for bringing in qualified workers to do some of the apparel manufacturing, and then examining the tariff schedule more broadly, looking at how the things like preferred fibers are treated. Unfortunately, we're kind of up against a wall because while Congress does have bipartisan support for increasing domestic manufacturing, because look, a lot of them have manufacturing opportunities in their district that would provide jobs for their constituents. The administration has said they are not interested in this. And this was a quote from the president a few months ago. "I'm not looking to make t-shirts, to be honest. I'm not looking to make socks. We can do that very well in other locations. We want to make military equipment. We want to make big things." Well, what he's not understanding is that fashion and apparel is big. We talked about this before. In this year alone, it's estimated to be $1.8 trillion worldwide. This is a big industry, and we should be taking advantage of that and utilizing it here in the United States. Next slide, please. Switching gears here just a little bit. We talk about sustainability a lot. It's not mentioned in the green guides. In fact, when they updated them in 2012, they officially said, we just don't have enough information about sustainability to come up with an agreed upon definition. And maybe we shouldn't have a solid definition, but I think there should be some sort of guardrails on the term so that the word does maintain some integrity. Otherwise, you can just throw it around and say, oh, this is sustainable, this is sustainable. And that's how you get into a big greenwashing problem. But for me, when I talk about sustainability, I think of it as sort of three pillars: the people, the products, and the process. The people are the folks who are obviously making the items, and you want to make sure that they have healthy wages, healthy work environment. The products, we want to make sure that the clothing that touches us doesn't have harmful chemicals in it. And then the process, sort of the resources that are used in the production of these items. So, for example, how much water is used when you're making something. So that's how I frame my thoughts on sustainability, but everyone has their sort of their own definition. I focus mainly on federal, but I just want people to be aware of two big state issues that are out there in several states. One is, next slide, please. Um, Extended producer responsibility, EPR, which is in California. And this is basically putting the responsibility on producers of apparel for what's going to happen to these items at their end of life. And the process is underway in California. We expect to see a lot of developments coming out next year. But there are a lot of details still to be worked out. But one thing everyone can agree on is that there's too many textiles in landfills, and this legislation and this law is designed to help mitigate that problem. New York and Washington State also have some pending bills on EPR, but in the absence of those states acting, and certainly in the absence of the federal government acting, California stands to be the national standard going forward. Next slide. And then the Fashion Act. Again, I think this is one that got a lot of attention. It started in New York, but 3 other states are also considering very similar bills. And it would require companies to map their supply chains and to look at make sure they're doing due diligence and looking at everything that happens throughout their supply chain, including human rights and environmental impact, and then ultimately being responsible for what happens in that vertical. Okay, three examples of fashion advocacy. I think we talked about a lot of these already. The green guides, the FTC petition, excuse me, on labeling, that was to allow for the digital labeling. And then Holly touched on the fashion czar, which was an idea that Politically in Fashion helped us spearhead back in 2021. It was one of our first initiatives. And the idea was to create a high-level person within the administration who would really have the president's ear and could advocate on behalf of the industry as a whole. So stop looking at it in this siloed way, just the environmental pillar, or just the trade pillar, or just the labor pillar, and realizing that it's all interconnected, and being able to see it at the 30,000-foot level and be that voice to the president. Unfortunately, this position has not been created, but we stand by this recommendation and hope that in the future, folks will take this seriously and really put this type of advisor in a position to make a difference for the industry. Okay, my last slide. This is my sort of takeaways for folks here today. There are all kinds of opportunities for you to engage either personally or professionally. You can come to DC, come meet your congressional representative, or if you can't come to Washington, everyone has an office back in their, at least one office back in their state. Call, write, email your representative, come up with ideas for legislation, write op-eds and letters to the editor about bills in support or about issues in general. I'm going to skip this middle one and go back to it in a minute. Submit comments for federal agency regulations. That slide I had before, and I talked about how they are mandated to have a public comment period. Use that. You submit it electronically, and it's on the website for everyone to see. And they have to, by law, read it and take it into account. Utilize social media. Develop relationships with your elected officials. If you're a business, or just as an individual, particularly if you're a business, know who your representative is. Go in and say to her, hey, I run a business in your district. I employ X number of people. We make this. But you know what? I'm kind of having a problem with such and such issue. Hope we can work with you about it in the future. They want to know who's there. And it's best to come in early and not when, you're on fire and you're in need of urgent help. Try and build those relationships as early as possible. Join networking groups as individuals, join trade associations, try and find like-minded allies within your industry, because there's safety in numbers. It's great to be able to amplify your voice. And I realized that a lot of folks, quote, big companies are very lean teams, and you don't have the bandwidth to have somebody full-time, following these issues. So that's where trade associations and working with your colleagues can really help you. And finally, participate in a press event when you can. Particularly if you're working for a brand, the names are a real draw. And I know that can be a double-edged sword for people sometimes. They're like, oh, I don't want to put ourselves out there. But elected representatives love when a big name comes to town and they can say, oh, look who's here. And it gets an issue attention. And like I said before, there are so many issues happening right now. There's so much noise. If there's something like that, you've got a name that will set you apart and get attention to your issue, use it. It's a huge advantage that should not be underestimated. So I'm going to stop with that and look forward to having more conversations with folks.
Thank you so much. That last point, I was just reflecting, like you mentioned, the staffs are lean. There's not really at brands like an in-house person who can dedicate full-time like support to some things like this. And I think it just shows that, if you work for a fashion brand, like you can be the spearhead of this where you are, and just having an interest in it. I'm sure those of you joining today, like you joined because you want to engage politically in this way, or of course like learn more about what's happening in fashion policy or what's an option for you to get involved. I think this is empowering that any one of us can be involved. And if we have the interest and, the determination that to just meet people, meet like-minded folks, that you can be a champion, a political champion where you are, whether at work or in your community. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So everyone, you've asked amazing questions so far. I'll start asking from the top. Our question next we have from Holly, also Holly. How do representatives get co-sponsors and how often does this happen? Is it usually someone in their caucus or committee? Is it anyone the representative talks to / has a relationship with?
Sure. It can be any of those things, the short answer. So you can have two different things. You can have what they call an original co-sponsor or co-sponsor. And the only difference is an original co-sponsor goes on right at the beginning when it's introduced. So it would be, a bill by Ms. Jochmans with the original co-sponsors of, Ms. Carroll and Ms. Green and Ms. Powell. I'm just going across the top here. We introduced the bill all together. But Ms. Joy down here sees this bill after it's introduced and says, oh, I want to be associated with this. And so she or her staff would call up my staff and say, I would like to be a co-sponsor. And they add their name and you're associated with it. So you just called a co-sponsor as opposed to original co-sponsor. You get attention for it from press reports that might have come out about a bill being introduced. Members will also send around what's called a dear colleague. It's a letter. This is what it sounds like. It's a letter that says, dear colleague, this is my bill. Please consider joining me in supporting this. And it could be somebody who sits on a committee that's relevant to the bill, or it could be somebody who's not. They just think this is something that I support and I want to lend my name to this. And this type of thing, you can ask your member, if you see a bill out there that's sponsored by somebody and you don't see your representative on it, that's the type of thing you call up your representative's office. You send an email and say, hey, please consider co-sponsoring such and such a bill because of, X, Y, and Z. And a bill can certainly pass with only one sponsor, but the more voices, the better. If it gets more attention, it will more likely see some action.
Let us know, Holly, if that answered your question. That was a great question. Great response. Thank you, Hilary. We have a question from Elizabeth. Are there any trade associations / policy groups specifically for small businesses in fashion?
It's funny you should ask. Yes, that is something that I do. The Politically and Fashion Council, we are a trade association for smaller business. There are trade associations that represent the bigger folks, and they do a tremendous job on behalf of their clients, the American Apparel and Footwear Association being one of them, National Retail Federation. But that's not representative of the whole fashion ecosystem. And so that was one of the reasons I started Politically and Fashion, was I wanted to make sure that smaller brands or thought leaders in particular, had a voice and had an option to engage in Washington. So one of the things we do is we do quarterly meetings on Zoom. We do an in-person advocacy day. We do policy monitoring, and I have opportunities for engagement with the representatives. So if anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk to you more about how to do that.
Thank you. A follow-up from Holly is, can we ask our representative to write a dear colleague letter, or is it something they automatically do for a bill?
If it's their own bill, they will know to do that. Yeah,
Got it.
yeah.
We
Because
have a
that
couple of folks from the UK on the call that are interested in learning how they can apply pressure from outside the US. And thank you for being super informative.
I mean, it's hard to do because just logistically, I mean, you can certainly highlight the issue right through social media and bring attention to a bill or an issue that you support. Um, One of my first jobs was working in a congressional office and answering the phones. And going through the mail. So I would I would do the intake, and you'd call up and say, I'm supportive of HR 123, and I'd say, oh, thank you for calling. What's your name? You tell me your name. Where do you live? And they want to know who's calling from their district, and that's what really matters to them a lot. So in fact, sometimes they'll even refer it. They'll say, "Oh, you're not my constituent. I'll send you over to your representative." So it's hard when you're not in the country and not a voter in that sense. But if you work for an American company, that might be a good hook for advocacy. But really, I think social media is a great way to highlight the issue, because if ultimately what you're trying to do is get attention to get the issue moved, utilize the social media. They're all on everything. Some are on more than others, but all the members are on, the big ones, Instagram.
Yep, yep. I
Um,
really loved learning today about the EPA labeling program. Um, I I didn't know much about that, and I also wanted to ask, like I've been hearing a lot about digital passports overseas, and I guess if you can expand a little bit more about how that is being discussed in the US. You mentioned like we're probably far off from something like that with the labeling.
right. I mean, they're much further with that in Europe than they are here. Um, we haven't been having the conversations about it. Um, so it will take some time. But I think it's a fantastic initiative. And I think as Europe starts to move forward and people start to see it on their European items of clothing that we then buy, it may get more attention here in the States.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
We have Elizabeth asking, um, how I understand it though, DPPs are market entry requirements. So any brand selling in the EU will need them, even if they're US based.
I'm not an expert in the latest on the EU digital passports, and that sounds right, but I'm not entirely sure how it's going to play out.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if there's a dollar threshold or what.
Yeah, we'll continue to follow that. Have there been op-eds written in the US about a potential EPA program?
So Congressman Caston from Illinois and Congresswoman Salazar from the Miami area and Florida, they're the two that have the EPA volunteer labeling bill. And I know that they have done things in their districts to promote it. If anyone happens to be in Illinois or Miami, I know they're looking for folks in those areas to help amplify their message. But I haven't seen much at the national level on it.
Abby is asking, I'm curious about how big the impact of social media advocacy is. What does that look like on the other side? I guess, like, what are the conversations like about social media in policy? Is that the question, Abby? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I can clarify real quick. That
Yeah.
might have been a confusing wording, but I feel like, in my generation, social media advocacy is really popular, but there's also a lot of accusations that it's kind of surface level, like it doesn't actually have that big of an impact. So I'm curious, like what that looks like on, like on the legislation side, like do Congress, like do representatives actually pay attention to that? Like what does that impact look like? What does that process look like?
Yeah, I think they absolutely do pay attention to it, especially, when you tag them in the post. You know, when I first started on the Hill, the equivalent of that was people would send like the mass fax, and there was that same debate. Did it really mean anything, or was it just sort of, what was the term you used, a sort of like glossy or
Yeah, surface level.
surface level
Yeah.
out there? Because did it really take that much effort to like sign your, click a box on a petition and this fax would come in overnight? Whereas if someone took the time to write a letter or make a phone call, was that more impactful? And so that debate would go on and on. And I think it's the updated technologically update is with social media, but I see people utilize it all the time. Definitely social media strategies for legislation. One of the things we do when we come into town and we do meetings, we make sure we get a picture, with the member, or in front of their sign at their office, and tag them in all our posts, and make sure that we're getting the message out there that way. Because now with social media, it's not just the members seeing it, right? Everyone else is potentially seeing it too. Whereas a million years ago, when people were sending the fax, the only people who were seeing it was, the poor staffer who was taking it off the fax machine in the morning. And I've really dated myself by letting you know I worked in an office that had a fax machine. I was very, very young when I was doing it.
Did you have, out of just general curiosity about you, like your aha moment of pursuing sustainability in fashion at a government level? Like, where did it begin for you?
I guess it was sort of evolved over time. I worked in government for many years, and then when I stepped away and decided to start my own business, my own advocacy, I was thinking about areas that I was interested in, both personally and professionally. Sort of where did I want to focus my work? Um, and fashion for me has always been just a personal interest. I think it's a beautiful art form and way of personal expression. It's been a source of income and empowerment for women for centuries. I think it has a wonderful, rich history. And then working primarily in New York government and politics, seeing what an economic driver it is there, and really seeing it as an industry. And then seeing it other places throughout the country too, not just, sort of New York and LA, but it's really impactful throughout the country. I was looking for a way to sort of marry those two interests, and I thought there had to be a trade association on that, or some sort of networking thing or engagement platform for me in that space. And after looking for quite some time, I realized there wasn't for people like me, and there were a lot of other people like me out there. And so that's how we sort of came together with some like-minded folks, and I put together a Politically in Fashion, and we started it as an engagement platform in February of 2020. And so that went great about a month later when everybody was home and not really in their offices. But it turned out to be a great opportunity because a lot of these issues really resonated on a personal level. You started to think about supply chain in a way that certainly the average person had not, and what that meant when you couldn't get your PPE, and really then started to think about the chemicals that were in our clothing and what we were putting on our body. And so it really did take off sort of during that time frame, and that's when we had the Fashion Czar advocacy and talking about green guides. And I would say 10 years ago, there was certainly legislation and laws and bills that impacted the industry because they're an industry, but it was not as many or any on point for the industry the way there are today. So the conversation has completely changed in the last definitely 5 years.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. A lot of change makers in remake that I've spoken to have also around that time just started to find the same kind of path, like become aware and then doing research on who's actually doing and who's having these conversations, who's hosting them in this space.
I think a lot of it's consumer driven, right? I mean,
Yeah.
consumers are starting to care about this. You were starting to see action happening at the state level. States are often, more nimble, more quick to respond to changing trends. In many cases, more progressive than at the federal level, and the Congress starts to take note of that, and it started to grow. I mean, the Fabric Act is a perfect example of that. That's a build out of a California law and taking it to the national standard.
I think the last couple of questions we have time for now. Um, from Holly, we have, do you have any suggestions on, oh, yeah. I talk about this every day. Do you have any suggestions on getting funding for advocacy work? It can be difficult for nonprofits when donors don't see specific results.
Yes, that is true. And also depending on your structure as a nonprofit, you're limited in your what you can do for advocacy, based if you're like a 501(c)(3). So that's something, it's a conversation you have to have internally with your group. But the messaging has to be that it's the long game here, right? That there's not going to be a quick fix. You take every little win that you can get. So whether that be a bill introduction, a press conference, a post, something like that, that just keeps it moving forward. But it's a marathon, not a sprint, for getting through this. And I know people want to see more um, timely results, but unfortunately, that's just not how it works at the federal or even really the state level right now.
Right. Yeah, build in the small wins.
Yeah, and sort of framing your end game here, right? So when I work with clients, we think about what is it you're really trying to get here? Do you need that bill signing ceremony in the Rose Garden to achieve your goal? Or really what do you need is a tweak to a law, a reg change, attention to the issue, getting people to the table. Sometimes, a bill introduction is enough of a threat to get folks to the table and start having the conversation on the private sector side, to achieve what it is that you need to. So it's sort of broadening what your goals are with advocacy, I think, can help to manage expectations.
Absolutely. And lastly, Sarah is interested in joining Politically in Fashion. Yeah,
So
would love to join.
we have so we make is a member of our Politically in Fashion Council. Yeah, shoot me an email. It's Hilary@politicallyinfashion.com, and I can walk you more through the process, sort of what we do, who our members are. And then we have a newsletter that comes out twice a month. Again, shoot me an email on that, and I can add you to the list and follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn. It's just at Politically in Fashion.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hilary. With our last minute, thank you everyone for showing up today. Hilary, you have just made policy feel very tangible for everyone today. I would love to share everyone your information. We're going to send the recording of this afterwards. We're going to send a recap. Thank you guys for showing up today. You can always reach out to me, Holly at remake.world, and I'm also on Circle if you have any questions. Just a couple of upcoming things. I'm hosting an office hours next Friday on Circle, and then our final community call of the year will be Monday, December 8th. So look out for us on Circle for those events. And yeah, we'll send the recap soon. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank
Thank you,
you so
everyone.
much,
Nice to see you.
Hilary. Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye, folks.